In the summer of 1919, American intelligence officers began a remarkable project. They gathered statements from captured German officers, enlisted men, and civilians across the occupied Rhineland. They reviewed interrogation transcripts. They collected intercepted letters. They interviewed village priests, shopkeepers, politicians, and statesmen. And they compiled everything into a single report that would capture, in the Germans' own words, exactly what the enemy had thought of the American soldier. One of the most striking statements came from a senior German staff officer who had served under General von Einem, commander of the Third German Army. He had nothing left to protect, and no reason left to lie. When asked what he thought of the American army, his answer was unequivocal. He said he had fought the Russian army, the Serbian army, the Romanian army, the British army, and the French army. All told, he had participated in more than 80 battles across the entire war. And of all those enemies, he said, the American army was the most honorable. He called the Americans the bravest of all the enemies Germany had faced, and in fact, the only ones who had attacked them seriously in that final year of fighting. He said he honored them for it, and now that the war was over, he stood ready for his part to accept them as friends. But he was not the only German who felt that way. Elsewhere in the same report, Karl Finkel of Bolingen told his interrogators that the prevailing opinion in Germany, before the Americans entered the war, was that America was a money-hunting nation, too focused on the pursuit of the dollar to produce a strong military force. But since the American troops had been in action, that opinion had changed entirely. Finkel said that although Germany was at present a defeated nation, he believed they would still be victors in a war with any country in the world, with one single exception: the United States. These words, along with hundreds of others, were written down, translated, compiled, and filed. They became part of a remarkable document assembled by the intelligence section of the American Expeditionary Forces headquarters at Chaumont, France. It was titled Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 through 1918 and Kindred Topics by the Germans. The preface stated bluntly that the report contained unedited and unfavorable criticism, and that much of the comment was nonetheless favorable, which the compilers noted was therefore significant. The full document can still be read today, preserved in the National Archives and hosted by the Federation of American Scientists. The report drew from interrogation transcripts, intercepted letters, and interviews with soldiers, civilians, priests, village officials, politicians, and statesmen. It painted a picture of the American soldier that was contradictory, complicated, and undeniably compelling. One German reserve lieutenant, named Arnulf Oster, called Americans good fighters with nerve and recklessness. A shopkeeper in Dernau named Peter Bertram said he had been told that the American infantryman was reckless to the point of foolishness. A former Prussian municipal official named Otto Schranzkmüller declared that the American army seemed like a fine collection of individual physical specimens, but from the standpoint of military discipline, it was a mob. Pure and simple. The men appeared slouchy, he said. The officers did not stand out from the men in appearance as they did in any European army. And yet, even those who criticized the Americans acknowledged something undeniable. A postal agent named Anton Leasch conceded that American troops lacked the snap and precision of the German soldier, but that the cordial relations between their officers and men more than compensated for the absence of iron discipline. Another German citizen, identified only as M. Walter of Minderlitgen, put it more bluntly. The attitude of the American officer towards enlisted men, he said, was very different from the German army, in which officers had always treated their men as cattle. The report also captured what the Americans were like as prisoners. A German named Paul Heinemann described the Americans as what might be called bad prisoners. A group of 14 were brought in one day, he said, and when asked about their units, they refused to talk, they refused to work, and they talked back to the officers, much to the annoyance of the officers and the concealed delight of the enlisted men. Even in captivity, the Americans would not submit. That document from 1919 would become a kind of prophecy, because a generation later, the sons and grandsons of those same American soldiers would cross the Atlantic again. And this time, the Germans would have even more to say about them. To understand what German officers eventually said about the American infantryman of the Second World War, you first have to understand what they expected him to be. And what they expected was very little. Before the United States entered the conflict, the prevailing opinion within the German military establishment was dismissive, bordering on contemptuous. America was viewed as a nation of businessmen and factory workers, people obsessed with commerce and comfort, fundamentally incapable of producing a serious fighting force. The German word sometimes used was Krämervolk, a nation of shopkeepers. They had money and machines, certainly, but money and machines did not make soldiers. This contempt was not entirely without foundation. The Wehrmacht had been forged in years of rigorous training, steeped in a martial tradition stretching back centuries through the Prussian military system. German officers had studied war as a science and practiced it as an art. They absorbed the teachings of Clausewitz and Moltke the Elder. Their non-commissioned officers were career soldiers who had spent years mastering their craft. Their infantry had been hardened by campaigns in Poland, where they conquered a nation in 5 weeks, in France, where they defeated the French army, supposedly the finest in Europe, in just 6 weeks. In the Balkans, in North Africa, and across the vast frozen steppes of Russia, where they had fought against a Soviet force of millions, these were men who had experienced the worst that modern warfare could produce and emerged intact. Men who had marched through blizzards, survived artillery barrages that lasted for days, and fought in conditions that would have been unimaginable to most people outside the military profession. What could a country that had not fought a major war in more than 20 years possibly bring to challenge that? The German military intelligence apparatus had studied American military journals, observed American peacetime exercises, and assessed American industry and political culture. What they concluded was not flattering. Before mobilization began, the American Army of 1939 ranked only 17th in the world in terms of size, smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. Its tanks were mostly obsolete designs from the interwar period. Its artillery doctrine was untested in combat. Its officer corps, outside of a small cadre of West Point graduates and career regulars, was largely without combat experience. Its soldiers were civilians in uniform, drafted from farms and factories, from offices and college campuses across a continent-sized country. Many had never fired a weapon before they were inducted. Some had never traveled more than 50 miles from the place they were born. The idea that these men could stand against battle-hardened Wehrmacht divisions, units that had fought their way across an entire continent, seemed to many German planners almost laughable, and for a brief, terrible moment in early 1943, it looked like the Germans might have been right. The place was called Kasserine Pass. It was a 2-mile-wide gap in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia. The month was February 1943, and it was the first time American ground forces had met the German army in significant combat during the Second World War. The result was a disaster. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was retreating westward after his devastating defeat at El Alamein, pressed hard by Montgomery's 8th Army from behind. But Rommel was never a man who retreated quietly. He studied the Allied lines stretching across Tunisia and identified the inexperienced American Second Corps as the weakest point in the entire defensive position. His plan was characteristically bold and ruthless. He would punch through the green American troops at Kasserine Pass and Sidi Bou Zid, seize the major Allied supply hub at Tebessa, and buy both time and resources for his battered Afrika Corps. On February 14th, the German attack began at Sidi Bou Zid. On the 19th, Rommel's 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions lunged through Kasserine Pass itself. They hit American positions that had been poorly sighted by commanders who had never personally walked the ground they were supposed to defend. The Second Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had made a series of catastrophic errors. He had fragmented his forces across a 30-mile front, splitting divisions into isolated task forces without clear coordination or mutual support. He had positioned his own command post in a deep ravine far from the front, protected by engineers who spent their time digging elaborate underground bunkers rather than preparing forward defenses. Communication between units was poor. Intelligence about German intentions was ignored or misread. Units that were supposed to support each other did not even know where the other units were positioned. The raw state of the American troops made everything worse. Hundreds of recently arrived replacements had joined their units only days before the battle, many lacking adequate training or even basic familiarity with their weapons and equipment. At Sidi Bou Zid, the 168th Infantry Regiment received its first shipment of bazookas on February 12th. Soldiers were learning how to use them against German armor attacks just 2 days later. The Americans were routed. Rommel's panzers swept through the pass and pushed the defenders back 50 miles in confusion and disorder. More than 1,000 Americans were killed. Hundreds more were taken prisoner. Vast quantities of equipment, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery pieces were abandoned or destroyed. Total casualties exceeded 6,600 men, representing more than 20% of the forces engaged. It was a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the entire Allied command structure and delivered a brutal wake-up call about the realities of fighting the German war machine. The German assessment was swift and predictably contemptuous, but Rommel himself, in his personal papers, noted something that most observers missed. Even as he pushed them back, he acknowledged that the American defensive recovery had been, in his own words, first class at certain critical points. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had succeeded in damming up his advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes. The Americans had been beaten, decisively, but they had not disintegrated. The British assessment was even harsher than the German one. Field Marshal Harold Alexander and General Bernard Montgomery both concluded that the Americans were hopelessly trained and led, that they made poor soldiers, and that they were unlikely to improve quickly. This judgment reflected a deep condescension running through much of the British High Command. This condescension would prove spectacularly wrong. Because the Americans did something after Kasserine Pass that few armies in history have ever done so swiftly or so effectively, they learned from their defeat, and they transformed themselves because of it. Within weeks, incompetent commanders were removed without sentiment or hesitation. Fredendall was relieved of command and shipped home. In his place came Major General George S. Patton, one of the most aggressive combat leaders the United States Army had ever produced. The transformation was immediate. Patton imposed strict discipline. He fined soldiers for not wearing their helmets and neckties. He demanded offensive spirit from every officer and every man. Training intensified to a punishing pace. Tactics were overhauled based on the specific lessons of Kasserine. Air-ground cooperation, which had been abysmal during the battle, was reorganized from the ground up with new procedures and communication protocols. Equipment failures were analyzed and corrected. Replacement procedures were reformed. The lessons of defeat were studied, absorbed, and applied with a speed that reflected something fundamental about the American military character. Where other armies might have rationalized their failures, the Americans looked at what had gone wrong with brutal honesty and fixed it. Rommel himself later acknowledged this quality, noting that after the initial American setback at Kasserine, things had rapidly improved for the Americans, although, as he added, the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare would not come until Patton's army reached France. The army that stumbled at Kasserine in February fought with increasing confidence through the rest of the North African campaign. It performed creditably in Sicily. It grew harder and more capable in the brutal fighting up the Italian peninsula, at Salerno, at Anzio, along the Gustav Line. And by the time that same army crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, it had been transformed from the bottom up into a fundamentally different fighting force. The Germans were about to discover just how different. D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. More than 150,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel to assault the fortified beaches of Normandy. 5 beaches, thousands of ships, 11,000 aircraft. It was the day that would decide the fate of Western Europe. On a stretch of Norman coastline code-named Omaha Beach, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced a killing ground that should have been impossible to cross. German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran formation far more capable than Allied intelligence had predicted, had fortified the bluffs overlooking the beach with interlocking fields of machine gun fire, pre-registered mortar positions, concrete bunkers, extensive minefields, and barbed wire obstacles that commanded every approach. The beach itself offered no cover. It was a flat, open expanse of sand and shingle, swept by overlapping fire from positions that could not be seen from the water. The first waves arrived in chaos and carnage. Many landing craft were pushed hundreds of yards from their intended positions by strong tidal currents. The 741st Tank Battalion launched 29 of its amphibious D.D. Sherman tanks into the rough Channel waters to provide covering fire. 27 of those tanks sank before ever reaching the shore. The men who waded out of the surviving craft were soaked, seasick, weighed down by 60 to 70 pounds of equipment, and immediately under withering fire. Officers and sergeants were killed in the first minutes. Some companies of the 29th Division suffered over 90% casualties in the first hour. Radio communication collapsed. The carefully rehearsed landing plan disintegrated within minutes. For several agonizing hours, the situation on Omaha was so catastrophic that General Omar Bradley, monitoring reports from the cruiser Augusta offshore, seriously considered abandoning the assault on Omaha Beach entirely and diverting all follow-on waves to Utah Beach and the British sectors. But then something happened that the German defenders had not anticipated. Small groups of American soldiers, many of them privates and corporals who had lost their officers in the first minutes, began to act entirely on their own initiative, without orders from battalion or regiment, without coordination across companies, without any plan beyond the desperate logic of survival and the instinct that staying on the beach meant dying on the beach. These men started moving forward. They found gaps in the wire. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow passages through obstacles. They crawled up the draws and gullies that cut through the bluffs, pulling themselves through minefields and crossfire, advancing yard by agonizing yard. Colonel George Taylor, of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, rallied his pinned-down troops with words that became part of American military legend. "There were two kinds of people staying on that beach," he told them. "The dead and those who were about to die. Now let us get the hell out of here." They moved. Individual acts of courage, repeated by dozens, then hundreds of men, accumulated into a tide that could not be stopped. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore and opened fire directly at the bluff positions. Naval gunfire officers on the beach directed fire by hand signal when their radios failed. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Medics worked in the open, dragging wounded men to whatever cover they could find. By nightfall, the Americans had clawed their way off Omaha Beach and established a fragile but real foothold on the continent of Europe. Casualties on Omaha alone exceeded 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. Along the entire Normandy front, the Allies had put more than 150,000 men ashore, but Omaha had been the crisis point. It was the place where the invasion had nearly died. For the German defenders, it was a revelation. They had expected the bombardment, the ships, and the overwhelming material superiority. What they had not expected was the initiative of the individual American soldier, the ability of leaderless groups to organize themselves under fire, improvise solutions on the spot, and continue attacking under conditions that should have broken any army on earth. This was not the behavior of the poorly trained conscripts the German defenders had been briefed to expect. This quality would define the American infantryman for the rest of the war, and it would become the quality that German officers cited most frequently and most respectfully in their post-war assessments. After Normandy came the hedgerows, and for the American infantry, the hedgerows were in some ways worse than the beach. The bocage country of inland Normandy was a landscape unlike anything the Americans had trained for. Ancient earthen embankments, some of them centuries old, rose 2 to 4 feet high and were topped with dense tangles of vegetation and thorny brambles. Each field was enclosed by these natural walls, creating a patchwork of tiny enclosed spaces, each one a potential fortress. Every hedgerow could conceal a machine gun position. Every sunken lane could hide a mortar team. Every intersection was a potential ambush site covered by pre-registered fire. Most of the roads were too narrow for tanks. The bocage had been farmland for centuries, and every generation of farmers had built the embankments higher. Some were so thick with root systems that even explosives could not easily breach them. German defenders exploited this terrain with devastating skill. They placed machine guns at the corners of fields with overlapping arcs of fire. They dug mortar pits behind embankments invisible from the air. They zeroed their artillery on every crossroads. They pre-positioned snipers in trees along the lanes. And they waited for the Americans to come to them, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, in a grinding war of attrition that nullified every advantage in mobility, firepower, and air power that the Allies possessed. The American advance slowed to a crawl. Gains were measured in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. Rifle companies that had landed on D-Day with full strength were reduced to skeletal remnants within weeks. Replacements arrived, often with minimal training, and became casualties themselves within days or hours. The emotional and physical toll was crushing. The fighting was close, brutal, and intensely personal. Men fought from field to field, sometimes unable to see their enemy until they were close enough to throw a grenade. But the Americans adapted, and the adaptation came from the bottom up. Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron noticed that Sherman tanks attempting to cross hedgerow embankments would ride up the face of the earthen bank, exposing their thin belly armor to German anti-tank fire. Culin welded steel teeth, cut from the German beach obstacles that still littered the Normandy shoreline, onto the front hull of a Sherman. The result was a crude but effective cutting device that could rip through the base of a hedgerow, allowing the tank to push straight through at ground level. The invention spread through the ranks with astonishing speed. Within weeks, hundreds of tanks across the First Army had been fitted with these improvised cutters, which the troops called rhino horns. The hedgerow problem, which had stymied American planners and cost thousands of casualties, was solved not by a committee of generals, but by a single sergeant with practical ingenuity and scrap metal. This was the quality that German officers identified again and again in their post-war assessments. It was not discipline in the Prussian sense. It was not fanatical willingness to die. It was adaptability, resourcefulness, the ability of individual soldiers at every rank to think for themselves, to improvise under pressure, to solve problems without waiting for orders. The German military system, for all its tactical efficiency, concentrated initiative at the officer level through the concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. Officers were given latitude in how to accomplish objectives, but below that level, the ordinary German infantryman was trained primarily to execute orders with precision. When the officers fell, when the chain of command was disrupted, German units frequently faltered. The American army operated differently. Its soldiers came from a society where individual initiative was expected, not merely tolerated. A corporal who lost his lieutenant did not sit in his foxhole and wait for a new officer. He looked around, assessed the situation, gathered what men he could find, and led them toward whatever objective made sense. This was not something the military designed. It was something the American soldier carried with him from civilian life. The Hurtgen Forest, autumn and winter of 1944, a dense, ancient woodland stretching along the German-Belgian border south of the city of Aachen. It would become the site of the most brutal sustained infantry combat on the Western Front in the entire war. The Hurtgen was not supposed to be a major battle. American commanders initially viewed the forest as a secondary objective, a flank to be secured while the main effort pushed east toward the Rhine. But the Germans had prepared the forest as a defensive position of extraordinary depth. The dense canopy of fir and pine trees was so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Minefields were laid along every trail. Booby traps were attached to trees, to fallen logs, to anything a tired soldier might lean against. The old bunkers of the Siegfried Line, built in the late 1930s and then abandoned, had been reclaimed by vegetation so thoroughly that they were nearly invisible. Under that dense canopy, every American advantage evaporated. Aircraft could not identify targets. Tanks could not maneuver. When shells burst in the treetops, the explosion sent cascades of wood splinters and shrapnel raining down on the troops below. Tree bursts, as the soldiers called them, multiplied the killing radius of every round many times over. The fighting consumed American divisions at an appalling rate. The 9th Infantry Division was the first to enter the forest and was badly mauled. The 28th Infantry Division, a Pennsylvania National Guard outfit that had fought through Normandy and the breakout, was thrown into the Hurtgen in November and virtually destroyed. Within days, its infantry regiments were reduced to fragments. The 4th Infantry Division, veterans of Utah Beach, suffered comparable losses. Unit after unit was fed into the forest and ground down. Total American casualties exceeded 33,000 men. Of those, 9,000 were non-combat losses: trench foot, frostbite, pneumonia, and combat exhaustion. Men lived in frozen foxholes for weeks at a time without hot food or dry clothing. The constant cold, the perpetual dampness, the unending sound of artillery, and the isolation of fighting in dense forest, where you could rarely see more than 30 yards in any direction, all of it combined to create conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Veterans who had fought through North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy said the Hurtgen was the worst thing they had ever experienced. And yet they kept fighting. They kept attacking. German soldiers who faced the Americans in the Hurtgen later spoke of their enemy with a respect that bordered on bewilderment. These were not the soft shopkeepers the propaganda had promised. These were hard, stubborn men who absorbed staggering punishment and came back for more. In the midst of this inferno, a single act of humanity illuminated the darkness. On the morning of November 12, 1944, a 23-year-old German company commander named Friedrich Lengfeld heard a wounded American screaming for help somewhere in the Wild Sow minefield, a patch of ground the Germans had named the Wild Sow. The American had stumbled into the mines during the previous night's fighting and now lay in no man's land, unable to move. Lengfeld immediately ordered his men not to fire on any American medics who might attempt a rescue. Hours passed. The screaming continued, growing weaker but never stopping. No American rescue party appeared. Finally, unable to listen any longer, Lengfeld gathered a team of his own medics and led them toward the minefield. His communications runner, Hubert Gies, watched as the lieutenant crossed the road at the level of the wounded American. As Lengfeld stepped off the path, he triggered an anti-personnel mine. The blast tore deep wounds in his back and caused severe internal injuries. His men carried him to a dressing station, and from there to the main aid station in the village of Freutzheim. The injuries were too severe. Friedrich Lengfeld died later that evening. Gies later wrote that with Lengfeld, he had lost the best superior he ever had. Lengfeld was an exemplary company leader, Gies said, and he never demanded more from his men than he was willing to give himself. He never told his men to go and check. He always said, "Follow me." 50 years later, in October of 1994, retired Major General John Ruggles led a group of American veterans from the 22nd Infantry Regiment back to the Hurtgen Military Cemetery. Ruggles had served as the regiment's executive officer during the battle, when he held the rank of lieutenant colonel. The 22nd had sustained some of the highest casualties of any regiment in the Hurtgen campaign. Now, half a century later, these American veterans erected a memorial not to one of their own, but to the German lieutenant who had died trying to save one of their comrades. The bronze plaque they placed at the entrance to the cemetery, among more than 3,000 German war dead, reads simply, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." It remains one of the only known monuments to a German soldier of the Second World War erected by his former enemies. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes, Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The German plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was audacious to the point of desperation. Nearly 30 divisions, including elite Waffen-SS panzer formations, would strike through the thinly held American lines in the densely forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, split the British and American armies, and drive all the way to the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, it would cut off Allied supplies and force a negotiated peace in the West, freeing Germany to turn its full strength against the advancing Soviets. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Dense cloud cover grounded the feared Allied air forces. Strict radio silence masked German preparations. Intelligence failures at virtually every level left the Americans unaware that more than 200,000 German troops were massing in the forests just across the line from some of the weakest defensive positions on the entire Western Front. The initial onslaught was devastating. German artillery crashed into American positions at 5:30 in the morning. Panzer columns plunged through the fog. Entire American units were overrun in the first hours. 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, the 422nd and the 423rd, roughly 7,000 to 8,000 men, were surrounded in the Schnee-Eifel highlands and forced to surrender. It was one of the largest mass capitulations of American troops in the entire war. The Germans opened a bulge in the Allied lines that would eventually extend nearly 60 miles deep. But the initial German breakthrough masked a reality that would become agonizingly clear to the German command in the days that followed. At critical road junctions across the front, small American units dug in and refused to be moved. Every hour they held was an hour the Americans used to rush reinforcements forward. In the Ardennes, where every crossroads was a choke point, delay was fatal to an offensive that depended on speed. At the town of St. Vith, the 7th Armoured Division and remnants of the shattered 106th held a vital crossroads for 6 desperate days against overwhelming pressure from multiple German divisions. The defence of St. Vith was not glamorous. There was no famous, quote, no single dramatic moment. It was a grinding, freezing, terrifying holding action fought by exhausted men in snow-covered positions who knew they were surrounded and outgunned. But those 6 days disrupted the northern shoulder of the German offensive and prevented a clean breakthrough that might have changed the outcome of the entire battle. At Bastogne, the story became legend. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed forward by truck from its rest area near Reims, arrived just ahead of the German spearheads and established a defensive perimeter around the crossroads town. Within days, they were completely encircled. 7 roads converged at Bastogne, making it the critical hub of the southern Ardennes. On December 22nd, a group of 4 German soldiers approached the American lines under a white flag. The senior officer was a Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke, of the Panzer-Lehr Division's Operations Section, carried a written ultimatum. The message warned that the encircled American forces faced total annihilation and demanded their honorable surrender. The ultimatum was delivered to the acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, recalled that McAuliffe initially seemed confused. He asked, "They want to surrender?" When told that no, the Germans wanted the Americans to surrender, McAuliffe erupted in anger. He took the paper, looked at it, and said, "Us surrender? Oh, nuts." Then he dropped it on the floor. When Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry delivered the typed reply to the waiting blindfolded German officers, Lieutenant Henke asked whether the response was affirmative or negative. Harper told him the reply was decidedly not affirmative, and added that if the Germans continued their foolish attack, their losses would be tremendous. Bastogne held. For days, the surrounded paratroopers fought off repeated assaults while desperately short of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and winter clothing. Casualties among the wounded mounted because surgical supplies were nearly exhausted. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The fog and overcast that grounded Allied aircraft also prevented air resupply. The situation was critical. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. Allied transport aircraft began dropping desperately needed supplies, and fighter bombers returned to the battlefield with devastating effect against the German columns on the roads below. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army, which had wheeled an entire army 90 degrees and attacked north through freezing conditions over icy roads, broke through from the south. The siege was lifted. The Battle of the Bulge cost the Americans roughly 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. German losses were catastrophic, somewhere around 100,000 men, along with irreplaceable tanks and fuel reserves the Wehrmacht could never recover. The Ardennes offensive did not shorten the war for Germany. It shortened it for the Allies. After the Bulge, captured German officers spoke with unprecedented candor. The ETHINT interrogation program and the secret listening facility at Fort Hunt, Virginia, known only by its mailing address, Post Office Box 1142, produced thousands of pages of frank assessment. At Fort Hunt, more than 3,400 prisoners, including 15 generals, were processed between 1943 and 1946. The facility had been established on a former military post about 15 miles south of Washington, originally part of George Washington's plantation estate. At its height, it had 87 buildings, including barracks, guard towers, and a secret bunker dug into the ground and concealed by trees. The interrogators were hand-selected intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany and now spoke flawless German with the accents and idioms of the very men they were questioning. They used no physical coercion. Instead, they relied on patience, psychology, and hidden microphones planted throughout the facility, in the prisoners' rooms, in the corridors, in the mess halls, and even in the trees where prisoners walked, believing they were speaking privately beyond earshot. German-speaking monitors listened around the clock, flagging any conversation that mentioned keywords like atomic power, rocket, or submarine. What those microphones captured was extraordinary. German officers, speaking privately among themselves without pretense or self-censorship, consistently identified several qualities that set the American infantrymen apart. They spoke of logistics. The American supply system was unlike anything in military history. Where German divisions waited weeks for parts, the Americans seemed to possess an inexhaustible river of everything. They spoke of artillery. The American fire direction system could mass multiple batteries on a single target within minutes. German veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to massive but inaccurate Soviet barrages, were struck by the precision and responsiveness of American guns. They spoke of air power. By 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was total. The P-47 Thunderbolt roamed the battlefield at will. Von Rundstedt told interrogators after the war that overwhelming Allied air dominance was the foremost cause of the Ardennes failure, followed by the German lack of fuel and the systematic destruction of rail communications. But beyond all the material superiority, they spoke of character. Corporal Friedrich Bertenrath of the 2nd Panzer Division captured something essential. In Russia, he said, he could imagine nothing but fighting to the last man, because going into a Russian prison camp meant death. But in Normandy, one always had in the back of his mind that if everything went wrong, the Americans were human enough that becoming their prisoner was attractive to some extent. This was not a minor observation. It revealed something about the American soldier that went beyond battlefield tactics. The way an army treats its prisoners says something fundamental about the values it fights for. The Americans' reputation for treating captured enemies with basic decency was not merely humanitarian generosity. It was a strategic weapon of immense power. German soldiers who knew they would be fed, given medical treatment, and not tortured or executed, were far more likely to surrender when their position became hopeless. Every man who laid down his arms voluntarily was a man the Americans did not have to kill or be killed by. The humane treatment of prisoners reduced American casualties, accelerated the collapse of German resistance, and shortened the war. It was a force multiplier that no amount of additional artillery could have matched. The pattern across both world wars was remarkably consistent. In both, the Germans began by underestimating the Americans and ended by identifying them as their most formidable opponents. In both, the same qualities were noted: the informal bond between officers and men, the lack of Prussian polish, the willingness to fight and keep fighting, the ability to learn and adapt faster than any enemy, and the initiative of the individual soldier, that quality that could not be manufactured by any military academy or imposed by any system of iron discipline. In the First World War, German officers had noted that American troops were reckless in attack, insubordinate in captivity, and informal to the point of seeming undisciplined. A generation later, the same observations applied. American officers in the Second World War did not stand apart from their men the way European officers did. They ate the same food. They shared the same dangers. They treated their soldiers with a familiarity that seemed unmilitary by Prussian standards, but produced a cohesion and loyalty that was undeniable in combat. When an officer fell, the unit did not collapse. Someone else stepped forward. And they kept coming. That was what German veterans remembered most vividly. The Americans took their losses, reorganized, and attacked again. They fought like men who believed in what they were fighting for, not because they had been ordered to, but because they chose to. After the war, the Foreign Military Studies program employed captured German officers to produce hundreds of manuscripts analyzing the conflict from the German perspective. The portrait of the American infantryman that emerged was honest and nuanced. German officers criticized American tactics as sometimes wasteful and overly reliant on firepower rather than maneuver. They noted poor performance in first engagements. They observed discomfort with night operations and sometimes slow exploitation of tactical opportunities. But alongside those criticisms came recognition of something that no amount of tactical criticism could diminish: an army that learned from mistakes faster than any opponent. That replaced failed leaders without hesitation or sentiment. That absorbed devastating losses and kept attacking. And that produced individual soldiers who could pick up a rifle and, within months, stand against the finest professional military in Europe. Today, those documents rest in archives in Washington and across Europe. The 1919 Candid Comment Report is preserved at the National Archives and available through the Federation of American Scientists. The ETHINT manuscripts and foreign military studies fill hundreds of boxes at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. The records from Post Office Box 1142 were classified for more than 50 years before being declassified in the early 1990s. Many of the interrogators' stories were not told until the Fort Hunt Oral History Project, conducted by the National Park Service in the early 2000s, finally brought their accounts to light. The men who fought on both sides are almost all gone now. The last veterans of the Second World War are departing in their late 90s and beyond, taking their memories with them. The German officers who spoke so candidly did so as defeated men reflecting on why they had lost. Some undoubtedly flattered their captors. Some sought to rehabilitate the reputation of the Wehrmacht by portraying the war in the West as a clean fight between honorable opponents. Their words are not objective history. They are perspectives shaped by experience, bias, and the complex psychology of defeat. But certain truths run through those records with a consistency that is hard to dismiss. The Germans respected the American infantryman not for his equipment, though that was formidable, not for his training, though it improved dramatically, not even for his courage, though it was proven beyond question on beaches and in forests and in frozen foxholes across Europe. What they respected most was something harder to name. It was the quality that allowed a free, democratic, civilian society to produce soldiers who could fight and win against a military machine that had been designed and built for nothing else. It was the discovery that the supposed softness of a people raised in liberty was not weakness at all, but a different kind of strength. A strength rooted not in blind obedience or martial tradition, but in individual initiative, personal responsibility, and the unshakable conviction that what they were fighting for actually mattered. A German woman named Frau Lisbeth Schäfer of Wallander had written a letter in 1919 that was intercepted by American censors and included in that first intelligence report. She said she would like to go to America for a while, because it was certain that those people possess a secret method which raises the most common fellows into individuals who stand up boldly and move about freely and unconcerned. She never identified that secret method, but the German officers who fought against those common fellows, in 2 world wars separated by a single generation, came to understand it. Even if they could never replicate it, even if their own system of iron discipline and professional military tradition, for all its tactical brilliance, could not produce the same quality in its own soldiers. The secret was freedom itself. Not freedom as an abstraction or a slogan, but freedom as a lived experience that shaped how men thought, how they acted under pressure, and what they were willing to fight and die for. And the words of the men who fought against it remain, decades later, the most powerful and unexpected testament to what free men can accomplish when called upon to defend everything they hold dear. Sources: Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 to 1918 and Kindred Topics by the Germans. AEF. Intelligence Section. Chaumont, France, 1919. European Theatre Historical Interrogations. ETHINT Series. National Archives. Record Group. 549. Robert K. Sutton. Nazis on the Potomac. Stackpole Books. 2022. Sonke Neitzel and Harold Welzer. Soldaten. Simon & Schuster. 2012. Stephen E. Ambrose. Citizen Soldiers. Simon & Schuster. 1997. The National World War II Museum. New Orleans. United States Army Center of Military History. National Park Service. Fort Hunt Oral History Project.